Surely have a mic, but it doesn't. I'd like to welcome Professor Mohanan, Professor at the Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research, Pune. And also a warm welcome to the new students who have come to the colloquium for the first time. I'll keep this very brief, and I'm reading out from a note that Professor Mohanan sent us when I requested him for a bio note. I quote, Professor Mohanan has made significant contributions to linguistic theory in the areas of phonology, syntax, and morphology. During the last few years, his primary academic interests have shifted to scientific inquiry and the nature of academic knowledge and inquiry in general against the broader backdrop of human beliefs. His current preoccupation is to develop systems and resource materials for students to develop the capacity for critical thinking and inquiry with a focus on transdisciplinary inquiry abilities of scientific inquiry. Unquote. His lecture today is titled Integrated Transdisciplinary Inquiry Abilities Through Education.
There are two handouts. I hope all of you have these two handouts. I don't know. How many of you don't have handouts? You may have to sit with somebody who has these handouts. Yeah, or maybe read the handout.
It's there on the main as well. Yeah, sure.
I don't know if projecting this will. You can try, yeah. But this is font size 11. It may not work. And I don't use PowerPoints. I'm addicted to whiteboard. I use PowerPoint only when I want to talk to administrators. And I'm assuming there are no administrators here. So let me see if I can do without PowerPoint is easy, but without handouts and without whiteboard is somewhat stressful. But let me see if I can do that. Okay, I was going to begin by saying, let me go through the sort of main points on the first page of the handout. But since many of you don't have the handout, I can't do that. So I'm going to wing it, and perhaps this talk is going to be slightly disorganized. You have to bear with me. Okay. What I want to do is to outline a way of thinking about education. Education not at the elementary level, but at, let's say, grades 9, 10, 11, 12, and the first 2 years of undergraduate education. That's the range. A shift of focus from knowledge content as the primary introduce to the main themes. This is kind of difficult because this is not in the way I normally expect the audience to be. Okay. So I was saying a shift of focus from knowledge content to abilities in terms of what we want students to learn. So in the design of any educational program, the first thing that we have to ask is, what is it that we want our students to learn? What is it that we want them to understand? What abilities do we want them to acquire? What mindset, what predispositions, what habits of thought, etc. do we want them to have? So these are the goals of a program. These are the goals of a course, or maybe even the goals of an enterprise, educational enterprise as a whole. And these educational goals, the words curricula and syllabi are used in many different ways, but I'm going to use the word curriculum to mean the specification of the desired learning outcomes. Okay, what is it that we want to get at the end point, at the end of the educational program? If it is an undergraduate program, what understanding, abilities, mindset, habits of thought, etc. do we want our students to have as a result of our intervention? Those are the educational goals, same as curriculum. Then there is another question, which is the means to accomplish these goals. what should we do, what strategies, techniques, etc. should we use, what modes of intervention should we use to help students accomplish those goals. These come under pedagogy. What pedagogical strategies can we use? Okay. These pedagogical strategies obviously have to be aligned to the educational goals. So without specifying the educational goals, we cannot have a discussion of the appropriate pedagogy. So if you are aiming at abilities, you will use one kind of pedagogy. If you are aiming at understanding, you use a slightly different pedagogy. If you are aiming at both understanding and abilities, we'll use a combination of all of these. One of the things I have noticed is that quite often talks about educational reform, improving the quality of education, are restricted to improving the quality of pedagogy, leaving the educational goals constant. And the standard educational goals are really content, knowledge content. We want our students to understand such and such. We want our students to understand density. We want our students to understand the distinction between mass and weight, etc., etc. The textbook is a documentation of a body of knowledge. And by that, what I mean is textbook is actually a body of the conclusions that researchers have arrived at. And so we want to help our students understand the conclusions and maybe apply them. And this is traditional education. What I would like to do is to shift the focus from that aim, primary aim being the understanding of a body of knowledge, to primary aim being a set of abilities. And the knowledge would come in as a secondary goal rather than as a primary goal. And obviously that means a change in the pedagogy. Now, the goals that we set would be guided by a set of assumptions that we make about the purpose of education. If you ask the question, why do we want the young to be educated? Why bother? What is the harm if you don't educate anybody? Let's demolish, as Ivani Leach said, all schools and colleges and so on. What harm would there be? Well, we can think of many different answers. One answer would be, if you don't educate them, you won't get employers in factories and, in administrative offices. So the answer here is that we want manpower to do whatever it is that we want to do. We want nurses, we want plumbers, we want carpenters, we want ministers, we want mafia organizers and so on. So, and this is a kind of manpower, needs of manpower by government, industry and so on. The other is, we want students to have degrees so that they can get jobs and make a living. So this is what students think, okay? They want to be educated because they want to have a degree and so that they can make money. Parents also want the same thing. And what do the researchers think, the teachers, typically college professors, they are disciplines to survive. So if I'm a professional linguist, I want more linguists like me. I want to duplicate myself. So it is important that I do this, and that is their answer. Okay, various answers are possible. The answer that I have is we want education because we want well-being for humanity, for other creatures on the planet. Well-being along all dimensions, physical, emotional, societal, economic, spiritual, intellectual, health and well-being. And education is the means to accomplish that. This is a somewhat strange definition of purpose, but if you accept that assumption, then intellectual well-being is one of the components, and that's what I'm talking about. I'm going to ignore the other kinds of well-being, the emotional well-being, the moral well-being, spiritual well-being, and so on. And that is why some of the abilities that I would like to talk about are important. So for intellectual well-being, I'm going to choose enquiry abilities as an important set of abilities to contribute to intellectual well-being. So typically what happens is as I said, we help students to understand the conclusions. We do not help them to arrive at their own conclusions. So suppose we take the following oath. I am not going to tell you what to believe, and I am not going to tell you what to do. But I will help you to decide for yourself what to believe and what to do. I will also help you understand what other people believe and what other people do. But I'm not going to recommend any of those. It is your decision. Yeah.
What other people do and why?
Yes, absolutely. In some cases, I may not be able to explain that because they themselves may not know. Okay. So, for example, my brother went around with a video camera asking people who came out of the Ganapati Mandir, why do you go to, I don't know if you guys do this, you go to Ganapati and you do this, right? Okay, if you ask people, he asked them, why do you do that? And they came up with all kinds of ingenious explanations. Nobody had a clue. The only answer is, this is what my ancestors did. Okay, so in some cases, why may not be available, but it's an important question to ask, right? So one of the questions should be, why do you believe that the earth goes around the sun? Right? Most educated people believe that the earth goes around the sun, but only a small fragment of educated people, even among scientists, can answer the question, why do we believe that the earth goes around the sun? Why can't I believe that the sun goes around the earth? It's not a trivial question. Most people do not know the answer. Okay? So understanding answers to such questions would be important as part of learning enquiry abilities. Incidentally, if I don't want to sort of engage in a boring lecture, because I find that when I listen to a lecture for more than 5-10 minutes, I fall asleep. So to avoid falling asleep, if you have questions, please ask. Okay. This is not, I don't want to do this as a kind of formal lecture, but more like interaction. It'll be much more effective that way. Yeah, Rohit.
The last thing you said is stuck in my mind. Sometimes you may not know why.
Yeah.
What would deciding mean?
Deciding in the case of action.
In action or
Deciding what to believe.
What to believe. What does it mean to decide what to believe if I don't know why? Could it mean anything? That's what I'm wondering.
No, they are not making decisions. They are simply absorbing. The people who do not know why are not making decisions. They are absorbing the decisions for somebody else.
Yes. But
Yeah.
the question came in the context that education wants to teach people to decide what to believe
Yeah.
and what to do.
Yeah.
If they are to decide,
Then they have to know why.
Then can education
Absolutely.
avoid why?
Yeah. But my answer to her was, quite often, when I talk about other people's beliefs and other people's actions, I may not know why they are doing it, and they themselves may not know, because they may have absorbed it from, their tradition and so on. And we cook up stories, confabulate stories when we are asked the question why. So in some cases, I might be able to explain to students why they do what they do or why they believe what they believe, but not in all cases. Okay. Other? Yeah.
As you said that we are living in a superimposed world. Everything has been imposed upon.
Yeah.
We need to practice the tradition followed by our fathers. So for knowing why, everyone should be revolutionist like Marx.
Everyone?
Should be a revolutionist like Marx.
Okay. I don't really know how to answer that question, because I don't know what you imply by the word revolution. But let me put it this way, let me not use the word revolutionary. I would say simply a skeptical, critical thinker. You have to be committed to the position that you will not accept beliefs unless you understand the answer to the question why. And you have to make certain commitments. I'm not going to work out those details. Some of them are given in the 2-3-page handout, which you can read at a later point. But essentially, there are certain preconditions for doing that. And I think it is indeed possible for almost all human beings, I would say every human being, almost all human beings, to develop those mental qualities such that they can decide for themselves what to believe and what to do. It is indeed possible if we have the right kind of education. And so my attempt here is to outline what that kind of education would be, so that our students have the freedom to decide for themselves rather than to simply accept what we say or what the textbooks say. Okay. So that is one strand of this talk, namely how do we help our students acquire inquiry abilities, and I want to focus my attention to inquiry abilities in science. You also need to expand this to mathematical inquiry as opposed to scientific inquiry, conceptual philosophical inquiry, aesthetic inquiry, and so on and so on. Essentially, the whole spread of rational inquiry, of which scientific inquiry is one particular kind of rational inquiry with specific characteristics. Okay. The other part has to do with transdisciplinarity. And by transdisciplinary, I mean the concepts and abilities that cut across disciplinary boundaries. So if I ask you about the concept valency, double bonds and single bonds, where do these concepts come from? You will immediately say chemistry, right? If I ask you mass, acceleration, velocity, where do these concepts come from? You would say immediately physics. All right? If I ask you questions like allophones and phonemes.
Linguistics.
Wow. I thought nobody would. Okay. All right. Okay. But if I ask you, what about the concept of system, structure, and function? Biology? Sociology? Linguistics?
Management.
Math? Okay, these are concepts. If you ask the question, what is structure? The answer that you're going to get will be a transdisciplinary concept. Okay? So if I said something like structure is a configuration of parts of a whole and the relations between these parts, this could apply to any structure. It could apply to the structure of an atom. It could apply to the structure of a crystal. It could apply to skeletal structure. It could apply to sentence structure, word structure, the structure of a poem, the structure of a dance. Okay? Structure is a concept that applies across disciplines. And it's very important that students understand what this concept is before they understand the structure of a protein. Okay? The most basic foundational concepts and the notion of structure of a sentence versus structure of protein are discipline-specific concepts. So if you understand the transdisciplinary concepts, it helps you to move across disciplines. And a great deal of the basic education, and by which what I mean is the high school education and the first 2 years of college education should focus on some of these transdisciplinary concepts. So take another notion, history. When I say history, typically people have the image of what such and such king did in the 18th century and so on, what you learn in history textbooks, which is socio-political history. But I could also talk about the history of the universe, the origin of the universe as Big Bang theory and subsequent history of the physical universe, the origin of the solar system and the history of the solar system. I could talk about the origin of the earth and the history, terrestrial history. I could talk about the origin of life on this earth and the history of life forms on this earth, which comes under evolutionary theory. I could talk about history of human languages. I could talk about history of cooking. I could talk about history of fast food. Okay, all these would come under history, which should then be investigation of the past. And in that sense, forensics would be historical inquiry. Biography would be historical inquiry. Linguistics, historical linguistics would be historical inquiry. Evolutionary theory would come under historical inquiry. Big Bang theory would come under historical inquiry. Notice that history and historical inquiry have now changed from discipline-specific things to a transdisciplinary concept, set of concepts. So that's what I mean by transdisciplinary. That which cuts across disciplinary boundaries, and transdisciplinarity helps us integrate. So it helps us integrate between, let us say, biology on the one hand, linguistics on the other, human history on the one hand, and biological history on the other, and so on and so on. It makes it possible for us to integrate. And integrated studies of this kind that do not create boundaries is important. So in the way our institutions are currently built, people study human consciousness as part of psychology or neuroscience. Psychology is supposed to be under social science. But when it comes to chimpanzee consciousness, this is no longer under social sciences or humanities, it is in natural sciences, in biology. When it comes to Drosophila consciousness, there is a colleague of mine who is studying Drosophila consciousness. That has nothing to do with psychology. Psychology is a social science, Drosophila consciousness is biology. It would help if the people who are studying Drosophila consciousness, chimpanzee consciousness, dog consciousness, and human consciousness sat together and figured out the different kinds of consciousnesses and what distinguishes human consciousness from other kinds of consciousnesses. Yeah.
Is the history the only one of the many ways of interpretation of the past? So there are so many other ways like folks and myths, and can these ways be assimilated into what you call this transdisciplinary?
Yeah. When you say folks and myths, you are talking about the data for arriving at conclusions about the past. So when you are studying forensics, looking at, for example, history in terms of some person being murdered or not, you look at evidence such as fingerprints and blood stains on the knife and so on. That will be the data for arriving at conclusions about the past. Historians who do socio-political history typically study written documents. And so anything, the period of history before written documentation, they call it prehistory, which to me is a kind of strange way of thinking about history. What that means is if a society, if a community doesn't have writing, that community has no history. They have only prehistory, right? It's a very strange thing to say. So I'm not restricting myself to the study of written text as the only source for the investigation of the past. You can study mythology, you can study folk tales, you can study a whole bunch of other things. Okay, so for example, in order to study the Big Bang, the origin of the universe, you are not going to study written texts. That makes no sense. In order to study the history of biological species, you are not going to study written texts. You're going to look at fossil evidence. You're going to look at DNA, a whole range of other kinds of data. And what you mentioned as folk tales and mythology and so on would come under data that would help us arrive at conclusions about the past. So historical inquiry is studying whatever traces the past has left, examining those traces, right? And looking at, trying to arrive at conclusions about the past. And it doesn't matter what those traces are. Any trace that will help us arrive at conclusions. So it's a much broader concept.
So anyway, maybe one should think a little bit more. Seems to entail some problems.
Yeah.
When we are talking of Big Bang theory or what happened in natural sciences in the past, then there is a possibility of tracing cause-effect relations in a much more precise manner according to kind of theory which is much more accurate. And therefore, the methodology and the validation criteria would be very different in nature from tracing human history. For example, how Akbar behaved with Rana Pratap or whatever. In the second case, the kind of inquiry and the kind of assumptions you are using, they are qualitatively different, not quantitatively, qualitatively different from the natural sciences. And therefore putting them, just because the events happened in the past, therefore they are history, the inquiry may not have any unifying principles behind it.
Okay. I won't be able to answer this question in 5 minutes. I think to answer this question, it will take me about at least an hour, if not 2 hours. But I'm convinced that if you spend 2 hours, I should be able to convince you that even though there are differences of methodology, differences, perhaps even in criteria, I'm not quite sure that there are differences in criteria. Methodological differences, yes. But there are methodological differences between any two fields of investigation. the kind of methodology that linguists use in order to study the past of human languages would be different from the kind of methodology that biologists would use to study biological past. So there is no such thing as looking at genes and looking at similarities and differences between genes in human linguistics, human language history. But we have something that is similar, namely internal reconstruction and comparative reconstruction. That is also used for biological history. So if you look at the details, you will see significant differences across disciplines, across pursuits. But if you abstract away from those, at some point you're going to see the commonalities. What those commonalities are, as I said, I hope I will be able to convince you in an hour or two. I won't be able to do that because I need to flesh out the details. For example, I can only point to uniformity principle that Darwin appealed to, that historians also implicitly assume. That is one of them. Abductive reasoning is one of them that cuts through all these types of historical inquiry. Doctors use it, lawyers, criminal lawyers use it, linguists use it, human historians use it, biologists use it, physicists use it, all of them. So there are these strands, abstract strands that run through different kinds of historical inquiry, while it is also true that there are differences. Okay? There are differences, but I'm looking at the transdisciplinary commonalities. There is no doubt there are major differences. For example, quantitative inquiry may not be possible in human history, or especially cultural history and so on. Quantitative studies may be possible when it comes to linguistic history. People do use it. In evolutionary biology, yes. In Big Bang theory, yes. But one important difference that you did point out is the presence of a non-historical theory to investigate the past. This is what Big Bang theory actually does. You have to use relativity theory to investigate Big Bang theory, right? In the same way, if you look at historical linguistics and if you look at evolutionary theory, you find some assumptions about theory being implicit there, but they are not rigorously articulated. So you do need a theory of language change. You do need a theory of species change, or biological change, in order to construct a rigorous theory of evolution and a rigorous theory of human language past. We don't actually have that yet. We are on the way towards that. So the difference is largely a matter of rigor. And of course, differences such as quantity versus qualitative studies and so on. Yes, that is true. But then the quantity versus quality difference is not actually a dividing line between the so-called physical and biological sciences versus human sciences. There are human sciences that use quantitative studies. So we use a lot of stuff in phonetics, for example. Human studies, we use quantity. There are also parts of phonology that do not use quantity. But these are, to my mind, matters of detail. But there is a central thread of unity that cuts across disciplinary boundaries, even in historical inquiry. This is a very brief account. I don't expect you to be convinced. As I said, to be convinced, you need 2 hours extra separate for that.
So,
Yeah.
could you say what is abductive logic? There on your paper.
Okay, that I am not going to answer. Instead, I'm going to request you to look at the logics of scientific inquiry that is available at the website, because that will take me another 2 hours. Okay, but it's there. I think that logics of scientific inquiry was written for first-year undergraduate students, so it should be. I'm making the assumption it should be clear. Okay, the different kinds of logics: deduction, abduction, defeasible deduction, etc., are all articulated in that logics of scientific inquiry. Yeah. I'm sorry I used that word without thinking. Sometimes I use jargon without being careful. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So you said I should inquire about why does the Earth go around the sun, right? I thought that
I didn't say, why does the earth go around the sun? Why should I believe that?
Why should I believe
Yeah.
that? But the body of knowledge is so vast that if I go inquiring into everything, then I can't learn C++.
Yeah, I agree. But this is true about even knowledge, right? You cannot know everything. So you learn only certain things. So then the question is, what is the trade-off between knowing the reasons for believing certain things and knowing the conclusions? There might be some cases when I know the conclusions and I say something like, when my doctor tells me don't eat too much fatty foods, you will have, let's say, heart problems. I would like to figure out why, and I might ask the doctor, maybe the doctor himself wouldn't know. It will take me quite some time to figure out, or I might decide, oh, I don't want to find out. Okay. For now, I will say, well, the probability is that the doctors have done their homework and the scientists have done their homework, and there is a high chance, given a choice between fatty foods are harmful to you and fatty foods are not harmful to you, which do I want to believe? Okay, the first one. But I should know that I don't have reasons for belief other than somebody's track record. Okay? I might, in some other case, I might decide to challenge the conclusion and find out for myself. So each of us will have to figure out for ourselves what conclusion we would like to challenge, what conclusion we would like to understand the evidence for, etc. And we might have some differences depending upon our personal interests and curiosity and so on. However, there are certain aspects of knowledge which are fundamental to our worldview, right? So one of them is this, the idea that the earth goes around the sun, which constitutes actually the 20th century worldview or the 21st century worldview. Another is the idea that the existing species on the planet all evolved from, as Darwin would put it, a small number of species or a single species. Okay? This is part of a worldview. Evolutionary theory is part of a worldview. The atomic worldview, that all matter is composed of molecules and atoms and things which are smaller than the atoms, is part of a worldview. So we would like to know what is the evidence for believing that matter is made up of molecules and atoms and electrons. There might be other things which are not central to a worldview. So it would be for an educated person not to know the answers to those things that constitute our central worldview will be a gap in the education. Your question is, would it be so technical that it will take you 20 years? No, I don't think so. In fact, the evidence for heliocentric hypotheses is something that a 15-year-old can understand in, if you spend about, let us say, a couple of hours. Okay?
Relativity or quantum mechanics?
I'm not talking about quantum mechanics. There are, for example, if you ask me, why should I believe E is equal to mc squared? Okay, you'll say, well, I don't know. Okay? You may not be able to go through the details of all the calculations and all the mathematics and so on. So it is not possible for everybody to understand evidence for everything. Okay? But you might be able to understand the evidence for why we think that space is curved. That is, it is not Euclidean, it is non-Euclidean. That's not scientific. But E is equal to mc squared? Probably not. Okay? You may be able to understand evidence, the 19th century evidence for believing that light is a wave, and the 19th century evidence for believing that light is a particle, and understand the conflict between these two positions. But you may not be able to understand as you proceed further to quantum mechanics or the details, things like the uncertainty principle. Okay? You may not be able to know. Okay? But the only plea that I'm making is where it is possible for a 15-year-old child to understand the evidence, then in those cases we should engage in discussions on the nature of evidence. Number one. Number two, do not introduce these knowledge concepts until children have developed the ability to understand. So don't talk to 7-year-olds about the heliocentric hypothesis. Why should 7-year-olds come to understand that the earth goes around the sun? I see no reason why. Why don't you wait until they are 15, when they can understand the evidence? Okay, so it means the kind of restructuring, resequencing of curriculum topics. And this would come, yeah.
Are you saying that it's that you should not, better not to teach children so-called facts without the substantiation, without them being able to understand the substantiation for it?
Yeah, I'm not saying never. There might be cases where we may have to do it. For example, if I want them to understand X, understand the evidence for X, I may have to tell them about Y, and I may not be in a position to provide the evidence for Y. Okay? And let me give you a concrete example. When we, my PhD is in theoretical linguistics. So once upon a time, I was a theoretical linguist. So when I was a theoretical linguist and I used to teach linguistics courses, one of the things that we did was to begin by saying, we are not going to introduce any concepts or any propositions of knowledge until we have demonstrated the evidence for it. But then there is a difficulty because we have to begin somewhere. So we would say, okay, we are going to assume that there are such things as words and sentences. Okay? And we're not going to question those assumptions. These are kind of intuitively kind of obvious. People think that they know what these words mean, word and sentence. They don't actually. But we'll say that let's not get into these complications. We'll assume that there are such things as words and sentences. And then we will ask questions like, why should I believe there are such things as nouns and adjectives and adverbs? Why should I believe there are such things as subject and object and predicate? Okay? Why should I believe that a noun phrase, am I using jargon? Since you said phonology, allophone and so on, why should I believe that there are such things as noun phrase and verb phrase and so on? Why should I believe that English is verb phrases? We would go through all these questions, okay? Not take them for granted. And then maybe at the end of the first 2 years of linguistics, we will say, look, we assumed that we knew what the word meant and what the word sentence meant. We actually don't. What is a word? Okay? That's when hell broke loose. Okay? So it's possible to do it that way. I said, delay. Tell the students, look, we have not discussed this, but wait. Okay? Someday you might understand. It's possible because some of those concepts are very difficult. It might also be the case, like in the case of E is equal to MC squared, we don't expect high school students to learn the evidence, but only certain things. So there's no harm in occasionally bringing in certain things, but acknowledge that we're introducing this concept or this proposition without actually looking for evidence. And it's important that students understand what they are going to accept on trust and what they're going to accept like critical thinkers. Okay. And if they understand the spirit of that mode of functioning, if they've done it for about 10 things, it doesn't matter if they learn a few things, 2 or 3 things without justification. I mean, they have to know that it is their responsibility if they want to look for evidence and argumentation.
Yeah. So can we reduce the gap between the learning curve? For example, if a student is studying standard 9, if I teach standard 12 contains chemistry, how much absorbent he will be? Means how far we can stretch the mode of learning? Means, say for example, if a content of the higher standard having a gap of 4 or 5 years, how can we really fix it up? How much elastic is learning curve is?
My question would be, why do you want them to learn 12th grade chemistry at home? Why? So you have to give me an answer by saying, this is the purpose of education. And given that purpose and the value system of education that we subscribe to, and the current context and so on, and also the students' mental maturity and a whole bunch of other things, it is important that students learn such and such concepts. Then we can ask, if we have an answer to the question, it is important that students understand such and such concepts for the following reasons. You have to trace it all the way from purpose and goals and value system to the learning goals. Then we can ask, what is the best time in terms of the intellectual maturity of the students to introduce those concepts? Okay? So, granted that it is of value for students to understand not only the heliocentric hypothesis, but also the evidence for that hypothesis. We can now ask, what is the right age for children to understand it? But it's only after the first part, right? So I remember that at some point somebody asked me, how do you teach, tell me how to teach umbra and penumbra to, 6th grade students. And I was horrified. And I said, what earthly use? Why do you want to teach this stuff? And she said, it's there in the syllabus. So I said, why did they decide that it should be there, and why did the syllabus makers decide? And I'm not going to cooperate with the syllabus makers. My response was, if this is going to be in the examination, at some point, let's say 10th grade examination, then we will ask them, okay, 10th grade will be used for the following things. Now after you have had your education, now we're going to teach you how to pass exams, which has nothing to do with education. But you have to pass the exams. I will tell you the definitions of umbrella and penumbra and ask you to answer those questions. You don't have to understand anything. Memorize the stuff. This is important. So, do that. I mean, for 1 year in their life, they can go on to do meaningless, stupid stuff. No harm. But 9 years, they have had education. Right? Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah, it appears as if we are very sure about children of what age can learn what. Like when you say that it should not be introduced at age 7, but age 15. Is it so universal? Is it?
I have no idea.
Yeah.
I have no idea, and
exactly.
I don't think science knows.
Yeah.
So the best thing we can go by are some intuitions about and trial and errors and so on, and make some some guesses. I don't think we do. So let me give you one example of my own understanding of when kids are ready. I tried to do moral inquiry with 8th grade students in a school. And the same school, I did roughly the same kind of moral inquiry with 7th grade kids. The students were comparable in all respects. And one of the aspects of moral inquiry is step-by-step reasoning. So you begin with moral axioms, and then you deduce the consequences by the application of defeasible reasoning to these axioms to a moral judgment. It's kind of like mathematical proof in a step-by-step fashion. I found that the 8th grade kids could do that. They could, in fact, work out the derivation on a blackboard. With some difficulty, but they could do that. The 7th grade kids, on the other hand, were completely helpless. They had no clue how to do the step-by-step derivation. Now, this could be either because the 8th grade kids had practice in mathematical steps or mathematical proof, or it could be that there was something about their mental maturity, like teens. My immediate guess was there is something about teenage that allows them to develop the step-by-step reasoning ability. But this is only a wild guess.
It could also be space specific. In some other, very different contexts, 7th grade.
Possible. I don't know.
Very different.
Yeah. So my answer to your question is actually I have no clue. We have to make these guesses. Okay. Someday I hope we will be able to have a reasonable answer based on educational neuroscience. The subject of educational neuroscience is just beginning to develop. It's probably about, 5-10 years old. And when educational neuroscience develops, if you ask me this question 10 years from now, maybe I can give you a coherent answer. Right now, we know that the Piaget stuff doesn't work. Most of the conclusions that Piaget arrived at have been proved to be wrong. Okay, I'm not going to entertain questions on this. Okay, so forget that I said that. Okay, yeah.
My question is what discussion is going on? Any discipline, when it evolves, so it becomes interdisciplinary somewhere or the other. The thing is, if we are thinking about implementation 9, 10, and 11, 12, if you correlate it with any organization, there used to be different departments. Now there is ERP and everything. So director level, he knows everything. So how can there be correlation implementing this interdisciplinary approach? Because automatically when a discipline evolves, somehow or other it's getting multidisciplinary approach everywhere. So I can't understand what is the use of analyzing all this, because at certain level it is bound to happen. That like Big Bang theory, I can have a concept from geographical point of view, from history, but it's bound to happen. So at implementation at 9, 10, 11, 12 and first 2 years of graduation, what is the logic behind it? For a mass appeal, it will have some implications.
Okay, I am not quite sure what you mean by implementation, so let me make some guesses. One is the implementation of the idea that students should acquire inquiry abilities, right? And the idea that students should understand the evidence and argumentation for conclusions, not merely the conclusions. So what I said about heliocentric position was about the second. That is, it is not sufficient for students to understand the conclusion that the earth goes around the sun. It is also important that students understand the evidence and argumentation for that conclusion. This is easy, now multidisciplinarity doesn't come in. As I said, this can be communicated to students, 15-year-olds, in something like a couple of hours. I've done it several times. It is doable. It's not all that complicated. Perhaps you're asking me not about this aspect, the need for focusing on inquiry abilities, but the need for transdisciplinarity of inquiry abilities and transdisciplinarity of concepts. Now, interdisciplinary is distinct from multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary, at least the way I use. So let me simply say I use the word interdisciplinary to refer to the boundary between two disciplines. So if you have biology on the one hand and chemistry on the other, biochemistry is the interface between biology and chemistry. So the boundary between two disciplines, or the intersection between two disciplines, is interdisciplinary. Two disciplines. Multidisciplinary, I use that word to refer to the study of a problem from the perspective of many disciplines. Okay? So something like protein folding needs different perspectives. It needs mathematics, it needs physics, it needs chemistry, it needs biology, okay, a whole bunch of things. Okay? Something like consciousness has to be multidisciplinary because consciousness can be approached from different perspectives, from different disciplines, and you bring to bear your knowledge and strategies of different disciplines to study one problem. Okay? That is multidisciplinary. But both interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity presuppose disciplinary separations. Transdisciplinarity is above the level of disciplinary distinctions. So when I say something like the distinction between correlations and causes, if I say something like, it is important that students, 9th grade students or 10th grade students, understand the distinction between correlations and causes. It is important that students develop the ability to investigate correlational hypotheses. It is important that students develop the ability to design experiments to investigate causal hypotheses. Which discipline is this? It could be just any discipline, right? It could be biology, it could be sociology, it could be linguistics, it could be physics, right? So this is a transdisciplinary, the distinction between correlations and causes is transdisciplinary. And so are these abilities of investigation. This doesn't require a whole abstract, extreme depth. It is actually fairly simple. So let me give you an example of how you asked about implementation. I teach students to engage in experimental inquiry, that is I teach them how to design experiments to investigate causes using examples of the following sort. Here's a scenario. A brother and a sister grew chili plants, and they discovered that chilies were not hot as they expected. So the brother said, well, the chilies are not hot because they didn't get enough sunlight. And the sister said, no, the chilies are not hot because they didn't get enough water. And they started fighting. And the mother intervened. Look, instead of fighting, why don't you design an experiment to find out which of these claims are correct? Okay? This is a question that I give to students, and I say, okay, design that experiment. Okay? And here are the possibilities. Your experiment should check if both of them are correct, if one of them is correct, if neither of them is correct, and what kinds of experimental outcomes would help you to decide which of these. Okay? Now this doesn't require any chemistry, physics, whatever, but it does require understanding the concept of causation and understanding experiment design, separation of variables, and so on and so on. And this can be done in a 9th grade class. That's all that is needed, nothing fancy. Okay? Yeah.
No, I was just thinking in that sense that the Bloom's taxonomy of those something you can use with much younger children and would also in that sense cut across all disciplines. Because you have like infer, distinguish, differentiate, and you have substantiate, you have a whole list, which in my mind goes younger and also is transdisciplinary.
Yeah, I have two answers. The first part is yes, Bloom's taxonomy is transdisciplinary. The other part, I am going to be rash, and I think Bloom's taxonomy is a misguided attempt, because Bloom's taxonomy was derived from the existing practice of examination questions. It is not derived from a consideration of academic inquiry or academic epistemology. Okay? It should have been derived from what is it that we want our students to learn, rather than what is it that the existing practices test. And therefore, I think...
organized differently if it was organized or would...
No, it is organized, well... okay, I'm going to say this rashly, but I'm not going to justify my answer because this is another 2-hour thing. I'm going to say Bloom's taxonomy probably has some historical importance. It was a good attempt 50 years ago, but now I think we should just throw it away and look for these abilities in a more coherent fashion by looking at academic epistemologies. So Bloom's taxonomy, for example, has nothing to say about the distinction between diffeasible reasoning and deductive non-diffeasible reasoning. It has nothing to say about correlations and causes. It uses vague words like analysis, synthesis. I have no idea what these words mean. Okay? So it's pretty much, as I see it, it's pretty much useless in helping students develop the ability to engage in inquiry. So,
because I think it's still taught in B.Ed courses.
Yeah, that's because like they might as well teach Aristotelian physics. Yeah.
So you said, say the concept of Amran and Umbra's grade students not actually in a mental state to understand very clearly. So there are a lot more other topics. So when you take a 8th grade student learning about refraction, and when they learn the laws of refraction, they say sin A by sin R is equal to a constant and its refractive index. The 8th grade student doesn't know what is trigonometric ratio. That they will learn in 10th standard. And so in that way, when you study about waves, you say V is equal to F lambda. The student doesn't actually know the meaning of that equation. So when you look at it that way, you think that more than 75% of the Indian curriculum education system should be revised and revisited? I
wouldn't be able to say the exact percentage, but I would say a significant part of the curriculum can be simply trashed. And then we have to rethink what is it that we want them to learn. So let me give you some examples. I learned in my primary school the techniques of finding the lowest common denominator. Why? Why should anybody learn that stuff? I see no reason why. Okay? Of course, you might find some value for it later. I mean, you might be able to convince me that it is important. But why should I learn it at that age? Why should I learn arithmetic before I learn geometry? Arithmetic has largely, the shopkeeper's arithmetic has no meaning for little kids. Geometry, on the other hand, okay, number theory is the science of patterns of numbers. Children are not, at that age, very young children cannot see patterns of numbers. But children can appreciate patterns of shapes. So why not introduce them to geometry first? Get them excited about patterns of shapes. And then gradually teach them how to prove these patterns. That will be mathematical thinking, whereas the way we are doing math now in terms of arithmetic and shopkeepers, financial accounting, whatever, etc., is actually making sure that our children are incapable of doing math. Making sure that teaching them simply calculation procedures rather than mathematical thinking, we are turning them into mathophobics. And so this requires a complete revamping of math education. And in ways that I don't really know exactly what sequence and so on, but I know what is wrong with the existing state of affairs. You do not learn mathematical thinking in your entire history of math education. People who learn statistics learn to make statistical calculations. They don't learn statistical thinking, which is sad. So if you think that statistical thinking and mathematical thinking are important, then you have to change the curriculum in drastic ways. How exactly? I don't know. Those are matters of detail.
And one more question. Do you think, when you think in the mental level of children, there is a nationalized system for school education? Like, say you have ICSE, CBSE and all state syllabus. So different type of syllabus have different type of level of learning. If it's the same grade 9th standard, the ICSE students, what they learn is different from what the CBSE students learn. So when...
I don't know. I have no understanding of those details that you know much better about. I don't know.
Even I'm not very, I'm just asking,
Yeah.
do you think like all the children say in a particular mental level should get one particular syllabus rather than in different levels of syllabus?
This is like the question that was raised earlier. We need to know much more. Of course they vary. Children's abilities vary. That's fairly obvious. That a 10-year-old kid it might be very easy for one 10-year-old kid to learn mathematical inquiry, but his 12-year-old brother may find it very difficult. So there is considerable variation across individuals in different types of things. And various kinds of not only mental abilities, but also the kinds of learning that they prefer. So it may be the case that some kids prefer top-down learning, other kids might prefer bottom-up learning, some kids may prefer visual learning, others may learn auditory learning. So there are all kinds of variations across individuals, both in variety and also in terms of the depth of learning. We don't know enough about any of these actually to make informed decisions. So my answer is, let's make some trial and error, experiments and find out and make some informed guesses. That's the best we can do. We don't have a reliable body of knowledge to make these decisions. So you have to just go to the classroom and experiment and find out. And I don't have experience of teaching elementary school kids to say anything, anything serious about, anything intelligent about these things. For me, elementary school children are from Mars, and they're, I don't know how they work. Okay, I can talk about undergraduate kids. Elementary school children, I know nothing about. Yeah. Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm running the risk of too many times, and also just now proving myself to get a list. You see, this thing is too easy to gun at LC, and this comes too often in the conversation. Why LC? Why does the child require this? Or why not geometry? I think if we think a little bit more about what numbers do and what patterns in numbers do in terms of abstract inquiry and dealing with abstract concepts and abstract numbers, then the advantages of geometry and arithmetic perhaps could be understood better. At this moment, this bland statement. Another thing is that number is a very abstract concept, but that is for formal mathematicians. For a child, the idea of number may not be, it is abstract of course, but it may not be that difficult. So there are several layers to that. So one problem is this simple answer of why LCM, and they have very good reasons, but again they will require about 2 hours. But the second thing is, the kind of things you are saying about mathematics curriculum and other curricula, I think if people look at NCF, then perhaps the Indian curriculum may not be as bad and trashable as it looks in this kind of discussion. If we actually seriously look at NCF and some of these things. One last comment about, and of course there are many interdisciplinary, etc. For example, your Chile experiment, I have very serious doubts, but I will go into that.
Okay.
Not transdisciplinary. I would say science, finished, full stop, scientific experiment. Forget about transdisciplinary.
On that, I completely agree because experiment design is scientific.
One little thing.
Yeah.
I do not know your comment about Bloom's taxonomy, whether it was something which was published in the 50s or whether this was about the revised taxonomy of teaching, learning, and assessing.
Yeah, I'm talking about both, including the revised one. The revised one also has problems, and my objections are the same. And again, that we can discuss in a 2-hour. Yeah.
Lots of books in education and all the theories in education have problems. But it would be a slightly difficult thing to totally trash the revised. That's all.
Okay. to begin with Bloom's taxonomy and the revised version, of course it will be difficult, impossible, and unwise to totally trash anything, right? So when you make these statements like, let's forget about Bloom's taxonomy, I can't even totally trash Ptolemy's astronomy, okay? There are some very good things in it. Not everything about Ptolemy's astronomy is to be thrown away. Not everything about Newton is to be thrown away, only certain assumptions. So when you say throw away Bloom's taxonomy, what I mean to say is replace it with something better, okay? And rather than stick to that version, and for the following reasons. One, it is based on existing practice of examination questions, and two, it doesn't derive from an understanding of academic epistemology. And we can construct a much better taxonomy than Bloom now, so why bother about Bloom? Okay, that was my, I didn't mean to say that, you know, everything about Bloom is waste of effort. It did make an important step in the right direction. Okay, as for the number versus geometry, as I said, these are to be investigated by trial and error. Okay, my main objection was to teaching math as a system for calculations. So arithmetic is taught in terms of a set of procedures, and children master these procedures without actually understanding any of the concepts. They do not learn math, as you mentioned, math as a science of patterns. If we could do math as science of patterns, if you could do numbers as science of patterns, fantastic. The kinds of patterns, for example, that Ramanujan discovered. Let me give you an example, and I don't know at what age children would be able to do this. I've tried this with students. So I ask students, if you add up 2 and 3, is the output divisible by 2? No. How about 4 and 5? No. How about 6 and 7? No. Some prodding, and so precise formulation will take time. And then you say, can you prove it? Okay. My experience has been that initially they find it difficult, they don't understand it. So in some cases I may have to give a little hint saying, look, why don't we begin by saying, let x be any number. Once I say that, the proof is so simple. Okay? They say, oh, let x be any number, the next number is x plus 1, then x plus 1 is 2x plus 1. Proof done. Then I say, let's try the sum of 3 adjacent numbers. Then they say, yeah, that is divisible. Prove it, easy. Sum of 4 adjacent numbers, not divisible. 5, divisible. And after a couple of more steps, they immediately see there's a pattern there. Okay? And I ask them, what's the pattern? And again, children can come up with the idea that if it's an even number, it's not divisible, but if it's odd, it is divisible. Now you say, prove it. That's tough. Okay? Now, so this is, I'm talking about the math as patterns. So this is indeed possible. This is not shopkeeper's mathematics. This is math as patterns. That is of high value. Now, whether this finding the lowest common factor, I don't see how that, the procedure as an algorithm or mechanical procedure helps them to find patterns. Okay? My complaint about traditional teaching of math is conceived of as calculation, which is a pocket calculator can do, as opposed to the use of imagination and a sense of beauty, sense of symmetry, discovery of patterns, etc. That excitement completely disappears. You can use numbers to do this. But the point I was making was, it's easier for children to begin with shapes, because any child can distinguish between circles and squares and rectangles and so on, and discover patterns of shapes. That's much easier than patterns of numbers. So why don't we begin with geometry and then proceed to arithmetic or numbers? And there are many ways of teaching geometry. For example, I read some literature on teaching girls topology through crocheting. It seems that girls learn math much faster than boys if you use crocheting or knitting. I don't know. I mean, I just read a report. And topology is not easy to learn. Okay, but if you take that one, it's easier. You can use carpentry to teach geometry. You can use, I have used straws to teach geometry. There are paper folding to teach geometry. These are all good ways of teaching geometry, geometry as science and patterns. So the plea I was making was the shift of focus from calculation to discovering patterns, and then gradually to this abstraction, number as an abstract concept. Sphere as a physical object is easy to understand, but sphere as a mathematical object takes considerable maturity. That's very different. In fact, there are many friends who don't understand the concept of sphere as a two-dimensional object, as opposed to a three-dimensional object. That takes some mental activity, some mental maturity. Yeah.
So I have some question actually. I'm not clear about this is what hypothesis or this is a theory that you proved it already and it was about children, how we have to teach them. And another question is, do you teach diversity like olden age that one student learn chemistry, biology, everything, math, literature together, or no? And wrong.
I don't quite understand that part. The first part I understand, but the second part I don't quite understand. The diversity thing.
In some parts you mentioned that we have to teach children a question, they should question and break the topic to different parts and find their answer. To understand, they should not accept everything. That is, they have to learn different aspects. Not, for example, they should not go on this subject mathematics or history or something they have no thought. In olden, as I read in history, in olden age, people learn different parts. That means they became specialized in different things. Do you believe that kind of teaching?
I don't know, in fact, what the question is, so I'll simply answer the first one. The first one, what I'm talking about now is simply my own commitment to education, really. This is my choice. I have chosen certain particular purpose of education. I have chosen certain goals of education derived from that purpose, given my value system of education. And I'm talking about, if you accept those goals, if you accept inquiry abilities in scientific inquiry as one of the goals of science education, what are the kinds of things that we need to do? Okay? Now, this is not a theory in the sense, it is not a scientific theory, it is not a proven theory. I'm simply sharing some of my commitments, some of my experiences, and some of my ideas. So this will not be something that I'm going to demonstrate through evidence and argumentation. If you ask me, what is the evidence for anything that you're saying? I will not be able to answer that question. Because to answer that question, I have to look at the effectiveness of some of these strategies using scientific means. I haven't done that, and I have no intention of doing that. And I'll explain, again, that will be the reason why I'm not willing to do that. Will take me about 2 hours, so I will skip that part. 10 minutes, okay. There is one thing that I didn't respond to in what Rohit said, and that is about transdisciplinarity of this the experiment of the Chile experiment. It is transdisciplinary, but within scientific inquiry. Experiment design is the prototypical character of scientific inquiry. Okay, and it can be in linguistics, it can be in sociology, it can be in economics, but it is a prototypical character of scientific inquiry. So it is transdisciplinary in the sense that it is not specific to chemistry, physics, biology, earth sciences, etc. It cuts across all these science disciplines, but it is located within scientific inquiry. So there might be abilities or particular tasks which are transdisciplinary but restricted to certain domains. So take, for example, use of thought experiments. Use of thought experiments have a restricted use, in fact widely used in philosophy as evidence, as justification for certain conclusions. In science, you don't use thought experiments as evidence for conclusions, but rather as suggestive evidence and plausible evidence, and also to arrive at conclusions. So the use of thought experiments is different in these two modes. And yet, therefore, even though there are these differences, I would still say thought experiments is transdisciplinary, with some restrictions on the domain. There was another hand, yeah. Some hand there first, yeah.
Just related to what the conversation that you guys already had. There was a time when sociology was known as social physics. So, if the ideology of efficiency is what made the proliferation of disciplines possible, I want to know what according to you is the challenge to, in making this kind of project work in the context of specialization and super specialization. The other question was, since you talked about beauty and symmetry of patterns, how would you relate your understanding of the transdisciplinary concept with, say, the category which Kant used?
Which?
Kant.
Okay. 10 minutes. I have to do this in 2 minutes. I'm going to skip Kant. Maybe except as you can think of Kantian categories as, if you think in terms of modern neuroscience and psychology, those are the kinds of categories that we are born with. So flatness is one of those categories. Causation is another of those. The principle that things are rigid, moving objects are rigid unless otherwise proved, are sort of things that we are born with. So Kant was actually thinking about current studies of mind in neuroscience and psychology in a different way. So I would connect that to those things. As for the physics of society, this is another 2-hour project on positivistic sociology and interpretive sociology. And this division runs through sociology, anthropology, and a whole bunch of things. And personally, I wouldn't subscribe to either of those 2 camps. And what I'm trying to say is neither positivistic nor postmodern / interpretive, whatever words you want to use, cut through the Frankfurt School, and so on. These are these 2 camps in many humanities and social sciences disciplines. And I think it is unfortunate that this division exists. And what I have to say is neutral to that division. In fact, I think they're both wrong-headed. But again, I'm not going to justify that statement. Yeah.
So, you spoke about high school and undergraduate education. My question is, do you think the formal education system should be responsible for helping students find their element as in their natural aptitude and personal passion in life?
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, absolutely. Like, let me give you my own personal history. When I was a high school student, I didn't want to study after high school. I wanted to go study painting in Bombay J.J. School of Arts, and my hope was to become a painter. My father said, look, you can't do that because if you go and study painting, you won't make enough money to buy paints, you will starve. So your painting will die. So you have to get a degree. And, I trusted my father, and he said, why don't you do physics for your undergraduate degree? I had no idea what physics was. My father said, study physics, so I went and did physics. I hated physics intensely with all my heart. It was so boring, I cut all my classes, and I went and sat in the library and read English literature. And somehow scraped through physics. Actually, I passed physics because a friend asked me to teach him. Otherwise, I would have flunked. So my father said, okay, you obviously hate physics, but you love English literature, so why don't you take a master's in English literature? So I thought, yeah, why not? I've read all these things anyway, so I could do that. And I discovered, as soon as I joined the course, I hated English literature. It was terrible. I mean, it was like, the first thing that I wrote, my teacher said, underlined some things, and it's, who has said this? Which critic has said this? And I said, no critic, as far as I know, this is my position. He sort of struck it off and said, you can't say that. Some critic has to say it. I decided not to attend classes after that. And I read psychology and philosophy when I was supposed to be studying English literature. So essentially, the idea was that I was interested in anything that people didn't teach me. And I bumped into linguistics and studied linguistics on my own. I got very, very much interested. And when I went to MIT, nobody tried to teach me linguistics. They said, join us, we'll do it together. And that was exciting. Okay? And I'm glad that this thing happened to me. If it hadn't happened to me, I would have been, I don't know, some grumpy old man who hates life. I would have been eternally unhappy. My brother-in-law thought that he had to get a degree in management to become a manager, and he did all that stuff and discovered that was not what he wanted to do. So after he was 40, 45, he resigned and then decided to do his PhD. There are many people who discover themselves much later, when some of them went too late. So if you could have a system of education in which we can help children discover their potential, what they really, I don't know what word to use. If I said what they are designed for, it suggests a designer. But where their heart is, where their inner being is, they would lead a happy life. It could be it could be painting, it could be carpentry, it could be dancing, it could be music. So my daughter went to Stanford to study medicine. After the first year, she said, I don't want to do medicine. It's a rat race, horrible stuff. I want to do biology. And she studied biology, and then she said, okay, I want to major in biology and drama. So we said, okay. And last year she said, there is one course that I need to do to get a major in biology, but that's a stupid course, I'm not going to do it. So I'm going to major only in drama. So I tried to advise her saying, look, it's just one course, stupid course, so what? I mean, what's wrong with just taking that stupid course? She said, why should I take that course? I'm not going to do biology in my life. I see no reason why. Why should I waste my time doing that course? She didn't get a degree in biology. Okay? But she's happy. And I think that enterprise of helping children discover what will make them happy in their life rather than pursuing more and more money is important. But we don't have a system for doing that. And one way of doing that will be expose them to as many things as possible, including, for example, such things as carpentry, farming, dancing, singing, painting, mountain climbing, I have no idea. Before they start specializing in, taking IIT entrance exams.
Yeah, but the situation in our country is we are talking of exposing children to things like painting and mountaineering. Most of our kids don't get enough to eat and not even exposure.
Yeah, so do whatever you can. Yeah, I mean, the basic things have to be taken care of, but that doesn't mean, the fact that they don't have enough to eat doesn't mean that we should abandon the education attempt.
No, I'm not
so make them
that.
watch ants move if they can't do anything else. That would be interesting, or make them watch worms, and so on. Whatever we can do. Mountain climbing may be an expensive hobby. Painting may be an expensive hobby, but dancing obviously is not, right? I mean, kids dance all the time. Yes?
But I like to see, perhaps we should decide judiciously what we want to go after. For instance, learning the heliocentric theory doesn't make any difference to my life. Like Sherlock Holmes, I can say, knowing whether the earth went around the sun or sun around the earth doesn't make any difference to my life. But shopkeeper mathematics might be more useful than learning the field things. Utilitarian stuff is important.
Yeah. So basically, you're saying something like before you graduate from high school, you should know shopkeeping. That can be done in very limited amount of time. Usefulness is important, but that doesn't mean that heliocentric theory will not be interesting for students. In fact, my experience has been that if I do this with 15-year-olds, the majority of them get extremely excited. I've seen kids sort of wandering around like pretending to be the sun and asking the other guy to be planet, and this is the planet, and this sort of spinning and so on. And I've seen kids doing this in the examination hall, sort of looking at a question and saying, doing this kind of stuff. And they are really absorbed. In contrast, if you try something like continental drift, there is zilch interest. So forget about continental drift, do heliocentric theory. When I do something like Cabra syndrome, all the kids are invariably so excited by it, and they say, give us more readings of that kind. And they want to know about Cabra syndrome, these are all kind of mental problems because of brain impairments and so on. So there are things that kids are interested in. They are curious about in finding these things for its own sake, not necessarily useful. There are some things which have usefulness value, and some things which have pure intellectual curiosity. And kids do want to find out about those things as well. So why deny them that? Yeah. So,
the you absolutely have to say before finishing?
No, I mean,
5 more minutes left.
everything that I have to say is in here. So this was actually a conversation kind of around this. I didn't actually go through it. It doesn't really matter. I'm happy with the conversation. And no conversation ever ends. So I leave it at that. There are many 2-hour conversations that we have been sort of hinting at. And hopefully we can continue some of those on email and so on, or maybe some other time. Thank you.